Hello there, friends. How are you doing today? It's nice to see so many of you again. We are in day 2 of Get Real with AI Governance Week. So, lots to talk about today. I am Jill Hines, for those of you who don't know, your friendly AI strategist and founder of Groundspring. And in this live stream series, I'm walking you through letter by letter through the Get Real method I developed to take a holistic approach to governance to make it practical for leaders. REAL stands for rooted, embedded, actionable, and legible. Yesterday, we talked about getting rooted. So that was all about understanding the ground truth of how AI is actually showing up in your organization before you try to govern it. Often we're doing the exact opposite, right? So if you missed that, I recommend going back and watching that, because today we're going to build on this idea, though generally speaking, the real elements don't follow like a step-by-step kind of program, but rooted is foundational for everything. But today we are moving on to the biggest letter of the group. Are you ready for it? It is embedded. So we're going to talk a lot about what that means. But essentially, before we begin, let's all make sure we've got our coffee ready. Do you have coffee? Do you have your water ready? Tea? Whatever beverage you need to like get us in the mindset and get us the energy to get through this particular topic, by all means, grab a cup. Embedded is big because really of the scope of what it is I'm talking about. It means that your AI governance has to show up sort of inside the systems that people are already using. And that's a lot of different systems, right? It can mean their workflows, their tools, their team rituals, policies. Basically, what we want to avoid is forcing people to have to remember, oh, I think we have a policy on that. Let me look it up, because nobody's going to look it up. It's just like not really what people do. Maybe legal, maybe HR from time to time, but generally speaking, a policy or a governance protocol that is not embedded is not going to be used. We need to figure out how to live the policy and how we operate day to day. So what I said about this entire REAL framework is that it is a design problem. So we're sort of approaching it from that perspective. We may have a disconnect between what we want to see in terms of governance, what we're actually seeing in our organizations. And that delta is what we are talking about today with the REAL method. It's a kind of a design-oriented approach to bridging the gaps. So AI technology, and I don't know if I need to tell folks this, but I'm going to say it anyway because it's important. I think this is really true of any technology at any scale, but you all know this is more than code, I hope. These are socio-technical concerns, which means they touch our technical lives, the interfaces that we use, the coding behind all of that that makes it possible, the data sharing back and forth, like that's certainly part of it. But that has real implications for real human beings like you and me. So these are, as I said, socio-technical concerns. And as such, when we think about governance, if we only think about it as a policy concern or only this technical implementation piece, we're just missing big parts of the picture. And we don't want to do that. Instead, I'm going to propose that we talk about AI governance in terms of 3 systems in our organizations. One is the people systems. We have lots of people systems. We'll talk about those. The technical systems. And then, yes, I am going to talk about policy compliance, that kind of aspect of our work. But maybe I'll talk about it in a different way than you might expect. We'll see. Given how deep we could go on each one of these topics, I'm just going to give you a couple of examples for each. And if you're really interested in digging deeper into these dynamics, I just happen to be hosting a Responsible Tech Talk this Friday at 12:30 p.m. Eastern. My good friend Claire Myers, who has a PhD in sociology, she's deeply expert in how people and technical systems interact and affect one another. She's going to talk to us. I think it'll be really great if you want to go that extra click deeper. But in the interim, let's start with our people systems. So when I say people systems, I am thinking about rituals, cultural norms, things that might be happening in meetings, in Slack channels, maybe even hallway conversations, interpersonal dynamics, and how leadership operates. It's also present in governance groups. So there are people who make up our governance committees, advisory groups, et cetera. And that's important. That people system does a lot of work. And there are also in a governance structure, a good governance structure, people, individuals who are accountable for certain activities in an organization for certain outcomes. So lots of area where people come into play. And people are important. Obviously, people matter. Nothing gets done without people being on board. If you want to see change, if you want governance that is going to thrive, you need to engage with human beings. It can sometimes be the stickiest of the widgets when you're trying to make things work, because people work, entails reconciling differences and understanding various perspectives and bringing it all together. And it can take a bit of time, but it's essential. I'm going to put some resources in the comments for ways that you can think about engaging with people and how people interact with one another to create kind of more ethical and responsible technical systems. So you can go really deep. I've got like a whole library of resources there, but you don't have to spend tons of hours and agonize over addressing every single person system at one time in depth. That is unrealistic. Again, human systems kind of evolve, right? So even if you take small steps in a positive direction, you're going to make some kind of positive change, and that is all to the good. So while I say, people are very integral, it's hard work, that's all true, but it doesn't have to be completely onerous. It doesn't have to be done all at once. Here's an example of what it might look like if you were to deploy your governance in a sort of manageable, incremental way in your people system. So, just think about regular cadences that you have on your teams. Maybe you are making space in your regular conversations in team update meetings to talk about AI and its implications in a way that welcomes questions, that welcomes uncertainty, that welcomes maybe more tricky ethical conversations, right? Because a lot of times people, they have these questions, they have these concerns. They might just be afraid to voice them to others. And that can be a huge drag. I think I mentioned this in the last talk, but it really does impact productivity. It impacts morale. So the more examples that you can set in a leadership capacity to make space for that, you are going to surface more information that's going to continuously kind of hone your AI governance, what training needs people have, the current state of the gaps, all of that good stuff is going to come out of just normalizing those kinds of conversations. So being vulnerable is really important. And again, in the articles that you'll see, modeling psychological safety is hugely important for ethical outcomes. And governance, in my opinion, is very much tied to achieving ethical applications of AI. Those are inextricably linked, in my opinion. That's a whole other podcast. But there you go. Small step you can take, make it a talking point in your meetings. Layer 2. Okay, so we're going to talk about these technical systems as well. This is where it can get really robust and sticky. I mean, they're all robust areas, but when it comes down to the technical systems, this is where your governance gets encoded into the tools and the pipelines that people use, into those workflows that if we did a good job in our rooted activities, we understand at a depth that makes the governance that we're proposing very relevant. This is powerful because it takes the burden off of people to have to remember everything, all the nitty-gritty rules, protocols, legal changes, et cetera, because it's built in by design, and therefore it makes it easier and more seamless to comply. There are some examples in the marketplace, and I think more and more entities, companies who are thinking deeply about governance in their products are doing these kinds of things to, again, ensure governance by design. And I think it's really smart. So for example, automating personally identifiable information, stripping out that information before any content goes into a large language model, for example. So you can imagine a healthcare organization that needs to use AI to draft patient communications. And instead of relying on every staff member to remember, like, don't paste the patient names and identifiers into the model, which is easy to forget when you're just copying and pasting, going about your day, they're building that redaction layer into the workflow. So that tool is stripping out sensitive information before anything's processed. And that layer is governance. It's an expression of your, in this case, it's often a legal mandate, but it could also represent a value that your firm holds, and it's enforcing it at that level. Another way you could think about how the technical systems can align with your governance is, let's imagine you are determining thresholds for loan applications. So maybe you're a financial institution, and maybe they set a rule that says, hey, below 85% confidence, if we're not sure, that's a flag for a human to review this particular application. That number, that 85%, didn't come from nowhere. That is, in some sense, a little bit arbitrary. It could be 86%, it could be 50%. That is where the human judgment comes in, and where your governance group may want to weigh in terms of what kind of risk tolerance do we have, what kind of outcomes do we want to ensure that we're seeing, and what number kind of best gets us there. But once you've established that sort of baseline, that number, you can build that in and have that trigger the right, in this case, it's a human review. So that value becomes an explicit requirement. It's a metric in the system, and also kind of a guardrail, again, all embedded. So the next layer I want to talk about, and we're going to get to it eventually. So here we are, policies. It had to happen, right? We're talking about AI governance. And I think, whenever I talk to groups about AI governance, and I've even had qualms about, like, should I, really represent what I do as governance? Because I think it's a bit more than that. And it has kind of a bad reputation because it feels heavy, burdensome, compliance driven. It's like forcing people to fit into this, particular defined box. And I really see it the other way around. Like, let's design the box with some constraints. Like, we have legal, ethical, regulatory obligations to form that box, but let's co-design what this looks like so we can all participate in it, right? So that's my take on it. And no one really likes these arbitrary rules with no relationship to how they work, which is why the grounding piece is so important. But the other thing I think that is useful about policies that people don't necessarily recognize, at least not initially, is that they're a very useful way to externalize your thinking and make your assumptions explicit. So kind of an interesting example, I think it was last week, I was talking to an agency. They specialize in doing sort of business strategy for folks. So you can imagine they're in a lot of spreadsheets, gathering data about business operations, crunching those numbers to make recommendations for their clients. And they are AI first, as they describe themselves. So they really like to lean on AI tools kind of out of the gate. And however, I also know that getting those things wrong is very existential to their business. If they make a poor recommendation, or if they have a number that they can't support through data, that's very bad for them, probably in a way that is magnified much more given the nature of their business. So when I asked, how do you maintain quality, which I know you care about, when you're relying on these AI systems, how much human review is there and how does that happen? They were, at least one of the owners was very adamant that they look at every single cell that comes out of that spreadsheet that the LLM helped create. They evaluate, really everything in detail before it goes out. So when I heard that, it's like, okay, wow, that's a commitment to quality. That's an expression of how you are achieving quality in your work and in your relationship to how you use AI. So write that down. That sounds to me like a governance principle or policy concerning human review and your commitment to clients. And now that is something you can also talk to your clients about and put into perhaps your contracts or your sales materials to reflect back, not only do we care about this, but this is how, from a policy perspective, we enforce this value. So I think that can be quite powerful. So write it down. All of these implicit things, all of these rules of thumb, And you might find that people are using different rules of thumb. Okay, and that's important to recognize too. So don't shy away from those friction points. That, again, as we talked about yesterday, that is your sort of gold for figuring out what needs to be done, the work that needs to happen to make governance connect the dots. So that is my sort of take on embedded from a sort of policy perspective. I want to see if I can show you an example, and you're going to have to bear with me a moment because I'm going to try to share my screen and show you an example of something I've seen in the wild on this topic. And it comes from maybe an unlikely source. I say this because I have some mixed feelings here. But I'm showing you an example of a diagram that comes from Roblox. And I say I have mixed feelings about it. My kids use this all the time, particularly my son. They're deep Roblox players. Roblox, as you know, has come under scrutiny because of its protections for younger players. It's a tough challenge. It's tough because they go through, I don't know, on an average, day, week, trillions of bytes of data. Like they are little bits of data that are exchanged at a scale that's kind of hard to even comprehend, and they have to monitor that and enforce their rules in that context. So I give them a little bit of credit for that. There's always more work to do. But what I did find on their website in their newsroom is that they talk about how they do this. Again, this is kind of a little bit policy, a little bit marketing, a little bit just externalizing assumptions. But you can see that here in the diagram, they have policy experts who are creating policy. They're establishing these golden data sets. So these are like their sources of truth in the data that feed into their sort of proprietary inference platform that they use to analyze cases that might be particularly difficult ones. Like something comes up in a chat and it's not clear if this is a violation of policy or not. So they have numerous means of evaluating those edge cases, and they set thresholds for what they're going to evaluate. We talked about that being, a governance function. And then as decisions are made, consequences to the users are kind of doled out, and there may be appeals, which all go to a human reviewer for QA, which is a part of their practice. That's it's also a governance and kind of monitoring and QA piece of their work. They've laid that all out here. So similarly, I really recommend, particularly on the technical side of things, that as you are building out AI-enabled tools, that you can express how your policy specifically connects in to the technical systems that you're using. And I think Roblox is an example of that. Is it the best? I'll leave that to you, but it's certainly documented. And I think that goes a long way to be able to interrogate it and ask good questions. All right. So we are going to take that away, and we are going to wrap up our discussion on embeddedness. So just to kind of recap what we talked about, embedded governance lives in team rituals. It lives in your technical pipelines, in your policies. It's not any one thing, but it is a combination of at least those three things. And what ties them together is that rooted piece. Like ideally, everything you're doing in each of these areas really resonates with how people are actually approaching their work, what their real concerns are. So if you're doing this well, it doesn't feel like a policy. It just feels like a way of working, and people are supported in that. That's the optimal sort of outcome for good embeddedness. Tomorrow, stay tuned, because we are going to talk about the next letter in our series, which stands for actionable. We need not only to be able to develop these policies, we need to not only define them and build them into our systems, but when something goes wrong, and it will, and we're going to talk about that too, please don't assume you're just designing for when things go right, because that's just not how the world works. When things go wrong or when there's questions, how are people to manage those things? I mean, governance needs to be lived and acted upon. So we are going to tackle that tomorrow, again at noon Eastern. And if you are in the Charlotte area, on Monday, June 29th, I'm going to be doing a hands-on version of this Get Real workshop. It's a lot of fun. We get together with a case study. We work through these sort of methods, these principles, and see how they actually play out in different contexts. You can also learn more about how I help organizations by visiting groundspring.ai. If you go to my contact form and you opt into communications, I'll send you an AI strategy blueprint. You can print that out, work through some test cases using some of these principles, and keep yourself grounded in reality. So with that, keep it real, and I will see you tomorrow. Thanks, everybody.